Hello, thank you for joining us for our introduction of our Research Handbook on Gender, Violence and Law by Elgar Publishing. I am Dr. Lucia Kula. I'm a lecturer in Law and Gender at SOAS University of London, where I also convene our LLM Law and Gender. My research expertise mostly focuses on gender-based violence, particularly with the intersection of women's lived experiences in conflict, and with a focus on border violence that happens at the border, and how that affects the everyday lived experiences with international law. My area of focus of law is predominantly in the context of Southern and Central Africa, focusing on Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I also look at the wider net of how gendered violence affects women's lived experiences, particularly marginalized women within the context of irregular migration and displacement.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nikki Godden-Rasul. I'm a senior lecturer in law at Newcastle University Law School. My research expertise is in the area of law, gendered violence and justice, and I typically look at alternative conceptions and practices of justice outside of the criminal legal system. So whether that's looking at civil law and civil justice, transformative justice or restorative justice. My teaching is in a module I run called Law and Gender, but I also sometimes teach tort law and criminal law as well. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of Feminist Legal Studies. So when I had the invitation to edit a handbook on gender violence and law from colleagues at Elgar, I was really keen to work with Lucia. I knew of her work through mutual friends, and I knew she'd be a fantastic colleague to work with, which has proved very true. Whereas I think Lucia was probably more stuck with me as I was already on the project. But it's been a really great pleasure to work with Lucia and get to know her and her work. So Lucia and I both bring something different to the handbook in terms of our research expertise and knowledge, as well as, different research networks and connections. But ultimately and importantly, we were really on the same page for the vision for the book. Gender as an identity and as a power relation is regulated and produced, amongst other things, by violence and law, and gender plays a role in shaping both violence and law. A whole wide range of feminist and queer legal scholarship has explored how law has or can be used to recognise, address and prevent gendered violence, as well as critiquing law's contribution to the reproduction of violence through legal discourse, institutional values, practices and processes. But what we thought was needed in this space was a research handbook that really takes a more expansive approach to gender, violence and law. So while the handbook covers paradigmatic forms of gender-based violence, such as rape and domestic abuse, as well as kind of newer forms of technology-facilitated violence and staples in feminist scholarship, such as structural violence, we also include other forms of gendered violence that are primarily captured within other research silos. So environmental damage, which can also be gendered, violence against animals, or colonial violence and epistemological violence. Taking this approach meant solidifying the theoretical grounding and literature that expands beyond the dominant Eurocentric depictions of violence and general societal understandings of what violence is and what violence does. The handbook spans a range of different conceptions of and different approaches to the law and legal phenomena across the world. This is also enhanced by the interdisciplinarity of the collection, which in addition to law includes international relations, social studies, sociology, history, public health, politics and media. We ensured that chapter authors took a wide range of approaches and perspectives and methodologies and are located in and write about different countries across the globe. To reflect current theoretical, epistemological and political challenges for research, policy and practice on gender violence and law, we brought together academics, activists and legal professionals with the handbook including already established scholars as well as exciting emerging voices.
So we decided to divide the book into 6 themes. We wanted to really capture the different conversations that were taking place within the handbook to highlight not only, as Nikki mentions, the intersections of different scholarships, but also ideas around how activists and non-practitioners are dealing with some of these pertinent questions. So the conversations that are shaping in the book are not just conversations that we think are relevant for the academic discourse, but also particularly in how we have, for example, conversations on gender, violence, and law within pop culture, within political discourse, and particularly within the everyday understanding of how gender, violence, and law affects our lived experiences. So the first theme of the book looks at manifestations of violence, right? This theme examines the spectrum of violence from an interpersonal to state level, focusing on how the intersections of gender and law function to both maintain and challenge social power structures. We argue here that these feminist conceptualizations are vital for developing the knowledge and activism necessary to utilize law as a tool for addressing and undoing gendered harms. We particularly highlight the conversations because we consider the idea that manifestations of violence are, of course, not just limited to the very basic understanding of what violence means when it comes to violence that particularly affects marginalized communities such as women or queer communities, for example. We expand that conversation to include other considerations in how we define and how we challenge ideas of law and violence at the intersections in the second theme of the book, which focuses on law, bodies, violence at the intersections. This section critically examines how legal and institutional systems intersect with gender, race, and sexuality to perpetuate structural violence against marginalized bodies despite their protective intent. So despite this idea that law is meant to protect us and meant to kind of mitigate some of the harm that occur in our society. We argue that a fundamental shift towards decolonizing law is essential to address these systemic failures and provide equitable justice for diverse identities currently underserved by the legal status quo. So not only having the conversation because we consider that the considerations of how bodies, laws, and violence are intersected and how we have this conversation, but also particularly how the legal status quo is in a way still failing to address these very intrinsic conversations that are taking place in different silos. In the third theme of the book, we focus on violent sites, spaces, and borders. This theme investigates how physical and institutional spaces, including borders and universities, serve as a site where law and power dynamics intersect to both enable and enact gendered violence. So we argue here that addressing these harms requires moving beyond legislative provisions towards interdisciplinary solutions that confront the systemic biases and institutional failures inherent in these specific environments. So not only arguing that violent sites can be considered spaces where we are physically present, such as the borders, such as institutions where we work, etc., but also particularly that the violent sites are constructed by a system that often fails to address harms that require more than addressing them through legislative provision. So how then do you include, for example, social legal narratives into the conversation without taking away from the legal discourse that is needed in these spaces, right? And that, I think, also speaks to the fourth theme of the book, which focuses on language, narratives, and representations of violence. This theme explores the multi-layered relationship between violence and legal frameworks, specifically analyzing the ethical challenges of representation and the systemic vulnerabilities such as immigration status and social stigma inherent in migrant communities, for example. We call for a critical shift in feminist and legal scholarship towards self-reflective practices that reject simplistic victim narratives and dismantle the colonial logic embedded in institutional responses. This particular theme is an important consideration around how we, for example, decolonize the conversations taking place in the academic discourse to embed also more personal reflections and narratives around how we talk about gender violence and law with an interdisciplinary and perhaps also transdisciplinary approach. In the fifth theme of the book, which focuses on feminist activism, social movements, and law, we examine the reciprocal relationship between feminist legal scholarship and activism, analyzing how feminist efforts have shaped legal change while navigating the inherent tension between working within legal systems and resisting their structural injustices. We highlight nuanced approaches to feminist engagement with law that account for varying legal contexts and advocate for ethical research practices that challenge colonial extractivism in academic work. So particularly looking at the considerations in how we, for example, consider work that is focusing on Indigenous communities or communities that are not represented properly within the academic setting. And that's where also the sixth theme of the book kind of has an approach to explore resistances to injustice by integrating a somewhat utopian scholarship. The sixth theme focuses on violence, resistance, and injustice. And it looks at scholarship with an abolitionist and social justice movement approach to challenge the interconnected patriarchal and colonial structures within homes, prisons, and legal systems. We emphasize here that building anti-violent futures requires a collective commitment to transformative resistance rooted in principles of care, solidarity, and liberation. So these six themes of the book are, for us, conversations that are taking place in the academic space, but are interjected or interconnected with activism, with practitioners, with other disciplinary themes that are particularly relevant for gender violence and law and are an ongoing conversation for us. This is not a book that is solidifying specific scholarship of specific discourse. It's more so a handbook that is opening up the conversation for us to include different dialogues.
So, well, the handbook, we hope, opens up different dialogues, as Lucia says. It still was written within and will necessarily reflect particular political and social contexts. In the introduction, we draw out the contemporary relevance and significance for a research handbook on gender violence and law. And part of that context is, because gender is so deeply embedded in hierarchical, social, political, and economic relations, that feminist and queer politics have been labelled gender ideology and set up as a target for emerging authoritarian regimes and expanding right-wing social movements. So as Judith Butler highlights in Who's Afraid of Gender, the anti-gender movement offers a target at which to direct many different public fears while accepting patriarchal gender norms which concentrate wealth, power, and freedom. So law is currently playing a really key role in shaping and reshaping harmful and violent power relations which demand attention.
And a lot of that conversation, of course, is relevant to the current questions being shaped around what is the status of international law, right? Is international law still relevant? And a lot of the chapters in our book were finalized before the current escalations, for example, within the US war on Iran, the interventions in Lebanon and Israel, continued interventions in Palestine, in occupied Palestine. So the broader themes are still applicable in terms of how we address some of these considerations within the aspect of law, and particularly international law. But the dialogues, as we said earlier, also speak to a particular context of setting future research agenda, of setting a conversation that particularly enables us to embed these conversations that are currently taking place within a more, let's say, holistic approach. What are the considerations we're talking about when we're saying international law is no longer relevant, or international law is at a crisis, when we don't include, for example, gendered scholarship in that conversation, when we don't include the impact it has on the most marginalized within the context of conflict, particularly armed conflict. So when we talk about what the handbook has to offer, we particularly hope that it also sets out the conversation that's still to be taken place in the future, but are rooted in some of the conceptual conversations that we are currently having within the handbook.
So what we really hope is that the book expands conversations on gender violence law and encourages attention to often marginalised feminist perspectives, asks new questions for future research, and inspires the next generation of scholars.
And when we talk about the next generation of scholars, of course, we're not talking just academic scholars. We're also talking particularly around practitioners and activists that are having these conversations with us, that are often forgotten in the discourse when they're doing work on the ground, when they're looking at the particular intricacies of the everyday realities of how law impacts our understanding, for example, of violence, our understanding, our conceptualizations of gendered identities, and what law does in these spaces. So the book is not only speaking to legal practice and activism, it is also solidifying the idea that gender, violence, and law must work and must be interdisciplinary and maybe even transdisciplinary to include those different conversations, those questions or those narratives that we are currently still having in silos, in separate rooms, to say.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoy the collection and that it sparks questions, ideas, and actions.
Thank you.